Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see so many of you here this evening here at the Royal Group of Institutions in Guwahati. Mr. A.K. Pansari, Chairman of the Institute of the RGI, Mr. A.K. Modi, Vice Chairman, my dear friend and opposition benchmate, Mr. Gaurav Gogoi, your Member of Parliament, and indeed Mita Dev, who I can apply the same terms to in our side of the House, of the Lok Sabha. Mr. Pradyut Bordoloi, former Minister, Ankur Pansari, the Executive Vice President of RGI, students, teachers, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for giving me such a warm welcome to this event organized by the Youth Forum on Foreign Policy. I still remember Gaurav Gogoi as a young student in the US when he came to see me in my late UN days and subsequently. And I've been so delighted to see that not only has he made an extraordinarily impressive career for himself, but that he has created an institution that has added to people's understanding of the world. I think institution builders are always the ones we must most appreciate because they create something that is not for themselves and that they leave behind an impact on the minds and hearts and lives of hundreds of people in time. I've had the privilege of participating in a few events of the Youth Forum on Foreign Policy, addressing a couple of them, and here to be part of your global lecture at this very impressive Royal Group of Institutions building and auditorium is a particular pleasure. And I must thank the two young people who are serving as compares, Aditya, I think it was, and Ria, particularly Ria, who managed to not only introduce me so beautifully, but actually pronounce Thiruvananthapuram correctly, which I can assure you I did not expect to hear in Guwahati. Nobody outside Thiruvananthapuram is able to say it, so that really is no small feat. Congratulations. You're already one step in the right direction towards a good international career. Now, as Ankur Pansari has already said, the northeast of India is a bridge between the two sub-regions of Asia, that is South Asia and Southeast Asia. Both regions are in the midst of tremendous positive change, spurred by economic growth and development. For various reasons, we in India have so far, to a large extent, not been able to leverage the various opportunities that this sub-region of India offers for the well-being and prosperity of our own people, the people who live here. Amongst the opportunities we should have seized and we should still seize are not only the geographical factor of being a bridgehead between South Asia and Southeast Asia, but also the natural and human resources of the Seven Sisters of the Northeast. Today's challenge, it seems to me, is to harness these opportunities to ensure that growth and development do not bypass this region, but in fact passes through this region and becomes a characteristic of this region. Now, one of the cliches you're all familiar with is that the defining feature of India is unity in diversity, and of course diversity in unity. I was just at the wonderful culture museum you have here in Guwahati, at Kolokshetra, and I was struck by the astonishing variety of communities, costumes, practices, appearances, ethnicities on display in these lovely dioramas there. And of course, this is true not just in Assam, which is what the exhibit is all about, but of all the other states in the northeast and indeed every region of India. At the same time, there is a strong sense of national unity and Indianness. I've often argued that while we are all in many ways possessors of different identities, what makes it possible for us to be secure in those identities is that we all share the collective carapace of the Indian identity. And that is why I think that we really do need to value the Northeast for what it is, to celebrate its differences with other parts of India, its differences within itself, but at the same time enjoy the fact that it is such an extraordinary manifestation of one aspect of this Indianness I was speaking about. The blessings of nature, which are so readily visible as you fly into Guwahati and look out the window as I did, It's not just the visual bounty that the Northeast displays, its rich biodiversity, its extraordinary hydro potential, petroleum and natural gas, of course, along with other great minerals, wonderful forest wealth. But I would say that even more than these rich natural endowments are the great human resources of this region. That's a unique endowment, and it's a reflection, I think, of this place being a confluence of such diverse ethnic, linguistic, religious, cultural, and educational currents. Of course, industrialization was brought to this region by the British East India Company in the early 19th century, as Gaurav Gogoi reminded us. It started really with the cultivation of the first export of tea, way back in 1839. I'm told tea was growing wild in Assam, but no one was cultivating it. The British, anxious to develop an alternative to the increasingly expensive purchase of organized tea cultivation from China, decided to do it here. And of course, the tea business has been the mainstay, including creating a new Assamese tribe I discovered called the Tea Tree People, who apparently originated from Bihar and Jharkhand, but have been here now for 200 years and now seen as a new tribe, as a separate tribe of Assam. Having said that, however, we've not seen the rapid development of other kinds of industry. Even coal was found soon here thereafter and exploited. That led to the development of railways, both private and government. The first oil refinery in the whole of Asia was set up in 1901 in Digboi, following the discovery of oil in Upper Assam. But still, industry didn't come. The oil, the coal, everything was shipped out of here to other parts of India. Now, it is important to remember that in the past, during the times of acute foreign exchange scarcity, Assam's tea and jute exports were, in many ways, the principal sources of India's much-needed foreign exchange. So, in many ways, it is all the more ironic that this region has not been able to take full advantage of the industrialization and economic development of our country since independence, and that significant differences in terms of some development indicators have emerged between the Northeast and the rest of India. Now, with the paradigm shift from an increasingly, or rather an overwhelmingly state-centered approach to one of more and more interdependence and global and regional cooperation, we've become, I think, far more aware and conscious now of the geoeconomic potential of the Northeast. As I mentioned, the obvious potential is as a gateway to East and Southeast Asia, and other speakers have alluded to that already. But it's obvious that by gradually integrating this region through cross-border market access, the northeastern states can also become a bridge in a different sense, a bridge between the Indian economy and what is arguably the fastest growing and most dynamic region in the world, namely Southeast Asia. While we live with the geographic fact that our northeastern region is landlocked, the geographical location of the northeast makes the fact of being landlocked less relevant, because it's a doorway now to Southeast and East Asia, and it's of course also vice versa a doorway for these economies into India. I mean, let's take some basic facts. A glance at the map of the region reveals that the region is almost entirely surrounded by foreign states. The seven sisters of this region are internally locked with concomitant locational disadvantages, but every one of these states shares at least one international border. The northeastern region is cradled by 5 other Asian states: China, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur, Mizoram, and Nagaland share a 1,643 kilometer long border with Myanmar. Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura, and Mizoram share a 1,880 kilometer border with Bangladesh. Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, and Sikkim share a 468 kilometer border with Bhutan. Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim share a 1,325 kilometer border with the Tibet Autonomous Region of the People's Republic of China. So the region's advantages in some ways, of course, have been offset by the difficulties following from the loss of connectivity and market access caused by the partition of 1947, where, for example, the distance from Agartala to Calcutta because it was no longer possible to transit through what became East Pakistan, suddenly multiplied by 500%. So there were massive market and logistical disruptions from which the Northeast still suffers, though these are gradually being overcome, and transit through Bangladesh has been successfully negotiated, and we will see more progress in all of this. But we've gone through 7 decades of disruption as a result of partition. The Gaurav mentioned the widespread hope here that the Look East policy would be a policy for the development of the Northeast. I think he's right. The UPA government, of which I was a participant, as you know, under former Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh, had undertaken a number of initiatives for a long-term economic impact on the region, including the launch of the Northeastern Region Vision 2020 in July 2008. And I came here in 2009 to talk about it. I think the vision is still a historic, path-breaking document which spells out the challenges that need to be addressed by any government. I hope the NDA government over the next 5 years will also take it seriously. The document lays down strategies for the empowerment of people through self-governance, rural development, investment in agro-processing industries and manufacturing units, as well as augmenting infrastructure and transportation connectivity. Incentives are also provided to some specified sectors like hotels, adventure and leisure sports, nursing homes, vocational training institutes, and of course the idea is to boost service industries in this region. Biotechnology was also put into the policy in order to boost biodiversity here. Now this may sound like a purely internally focused approach, but it was part of a larger picture, because our Look East policy, enunciated since the early 1990s, was not merely a matter of external policy. It was also a strategic shift in India's vision of the world and India's place in the evolving global economy. Most of all, it was about reaching out to our civilizational neighbors in the region and availing of the economic opportunities presented by these countries for us. Now, it's obvious to me, and I think to most people in government, that India's economic interests are best served by greater integration and connectivity with Southeast and East Asia. These are, again, I think Gaurav mentioned this, our natural trading partners with whom we've had connectivity, trade, not just during the colonial period, as he mentioned, but really for millennia before that. India strongly supported now the various new measures to improve the comprehensive physical connectivity that has died out because of not just partition, but all the other drawing up of national borders and so on, which have restricted easy movement, different ideological and political systems, which have also blocked the easy flow of people across these time-old divides. And these physical connectivity measures in recent years include the Asian Highway Network, a comprehensive network of roads connecting the countries in East Asia, the East-West Highway Project, which runs from Myanmar through to Vietnam. So if you can imagine, if you can connect from here to Myanmar, you essentially have a highway all the way to Vietnam. The most critical link, of course, is to create that road connectivity from the northeast through Myanmar into the rest of Southeast Asia. There is the Trilateral Highway Project between India, Myanmar and Thailand under construction, which would link us to the East-West Highway and the Asian Highway Network. Another important link is the Kaladan Multimodal Transit Transport Facility, which envisages connectivity between the Indian ports on the eastern seaboard and Sitwe port, the old Akyab in Myanmar, and then through riverine transport and by road to Mizoram, thereby providing an alternative route for transport of goods to the northeast of India. In other words, what we're looking at is rail, road and river connectivity, and eventually, of course, sea as well, from the ports of Sitwe, the port of Chittagong, ports of Calcutta, all of which are much more difficult to get to by the present land routes around Bangladesh and down into Calcutta. So this could be and should be transformative. The UPA government did attach great importance to the project. It decided to fund it completely on its own. The ports and the river transportation facilities were supposed to be ready by May 2015, but we all know the project has been further delayed, And let us hope, therefore, that Look East will be more comprehensively and effectively implemented than some of the other slogans we have heard from this government in the recent past, where implementation does not seem to have followed as well. But here I must admit that all Indian governments in the last 20 years have been relatively lacking. I think we had a clear vision, began the process, could not complete it in the UPA days, but it's now national responsibility for the new government to take it forward and complete this project. Now, Look East, of course, goes well beyond economics. It reflects a changed understanding of India's role in the world economy, signals a significant strategic shift in our attitude to international affairs, which I'll be happy to talk about in the Q&A period with all of you. It's instructive that no Indian political party, and let's remember that almost every Indian political party has been in power since the days of Narasimha Rao, no party has questioned either the underpinnings or the manifestations of the Look East policy. Today, the NDA government has launched it or relaunched it as an Act East policy. That was a phrase they used during the India-ASEAN summit in Myanmar in November 2014. But I have to admit that other than the new label, there are no significant differences of either substance or result. And that is true of many other new labels we have been treated to in the last year and a bit, but I'm not going to make this a political speech. One factor that helped to drive the Look East policy was undoubtedly China's early interest in the region. During the Cold War, Southeast Asia saw itself threatened by the risk of communist expansion, but once China opened up its economy to the outside world and became a major trading power, I think the prospects of military adventurism receded. People weren't worried so much about some communist menace coming to take over their countries. China was seen much more benignly, but of course, as a country with tremendous economic ambitions. At the same time, with the growing economic might came growing military might, which did cast a shadow over a region that had for many, many years been wary of Beijing. India's interest in engaging more deeply offered the nations of Southeast Asia the prospect of a democratic and non-threatening counterbalance. I think it's very safe to say that no country, with the possible exception of Pakistan, but even I don't really believe that, feels threatened in any way by India, whereas that is not easy to say about China. For years, India had been bogged down in its own neighborhood, of course, and dismissed by most, especially by Beijing, as at best a subcontinental power, one that could easily be contained by stoking the hostility of Pakistan. But with the Act East policy, I think we're breaking free of that perception. Our own present Prime Minister has tended to align his government with those critical of China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, the East China Sea as well, and he signaled his determination to prioritize India's relations with Japan and Australia, as well as with countries in India's immediate neighborhood. Now, this is essentially a continuity of policy, but again, as we've seen with this government, a lot more overt emphasis has been placed on matters that in the Manmohan Singh government were done, but were done much more subtly and with nuance. But the policy itself is the same, just prosecuted with a lot more overt articulation and perhaps visibility. India, let's be very blunt, does not have either the economic or the military might to counter China, which has a GDP of more than 4 times India's size. I think that I've always been of the view that creating an artificial race in people's minds between India and China is foolhardy. The way we should think about countries in today's world is that both should be able to grow and prosper and fulfill the needs of their own people. I see no reason to see a competition as long as my fellow citizens in India are able to eat 3 square meals a day, lead decent lives, educate their children, look after their health, and work productively for their own futures. To my mind, it doesn't matter how many Chinese are doing better or worse. For me, it's my own country that matters, and I think that's true for most of us. So let's not worry about the competition. But at the same time, let us also acknowledge that we do have a need to capitalize on our advantages, our geopolitical importance in this area, the fact that other countries seem to need us to be a sort of balancing force in the region. We know that China has significantly increased its presence in the Indian Ocean, with news reports claiming that China is setting up 18 naval bases in the region, though this has been officially denied by Beijing. China's efforts to develop strategic relationships in Asia, going beyond Pakistan, I might add. It has continued with an enhanced Chinese presence in recent years in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, in Bangladesh. These are not entirely innocent, and so we cannot be completely oblivious to them either. In parallel, however, there has been a growing demand for a wider and deeper Indian security role in the broader region. That demand has come from countries like Singapore and Malaysia in Southeast Asia. So apart from promoting the credentials of Act East as an upgraded policy, it seems to me the NDA government needs to act quickly and effectively on its promises for securing economic and security relations with our neighbors in East and Southeast Asia. Yes, in part to offset China's own efforts, not in a spirit of competition, but in a spirit of our own self-preservation and our own self-respect. I think our deepening defense ties with the US, Australia, Japan, and Vietnam are a vital part of this undertaking. As you all might be aware, Look East began with trade, but soon expanded to include diplomatic dialogue and strategic and military cooperation. The India-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement on goods, which was adopted in August 2009 in the face of critical domestic opposition from many farmers in India, is perhaps the most striking evidence of the strategic priority accorded by the UPA government to commercial relations in the region. It would have been very easy to give in to the domestic pressures which were very strong against this agreement, but as part of Look East, our government was determined to go ahead with it. And in addition, a host of bilateral agreements were signed with individual countries, FTAs with Sri Lanka and Thailand, comprehensive economic partnership agreements with Singapore, South Korea, Malaysia and Japan, an early harvest scheme with Thailand, as well as strong commercial, cultural and military ties with individual ASEAN members, notably the Philippines, Singapore, Vietnam and Cambodia. This year in February, our new finance minister has announced that India would set up manufacturing hubs in Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos and Vietnam. Relations have been upgraded to strategic partnerships with Japan, South Korea and even Taiwan. Japan and South Korea clearly began to take India more seriously after the India-ASEAN relationship improved and India began engaging with the region's leaders at summit level. Now, the Japanese cumulative FDI in India, however, is only about just under $16 billion, and that's over 15 years, so we're not talking a large sum of money. In fact, the trend, if anything, has been negative. Japanese FDI inflow declined from $5.5 billion in 2008 to just $1.7 billion in 2014. But there are global factors also at play here. It's not just a bilateral calculation. Japan is, however, a very generous purveyor of official development assistance for infrastructure development. One of the most important current Indo-Japanese projects is actually not in the northeast. It's the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, which will take an estimated investment of $90 billion, and that will transform a vast stretch of territory between the nation's administrative capital and its commercial capital. Japan has already promised an initial investment of $4.5 billion in the first phase of this project. Our regular bilateral naval exercises reflect the fact that more than 50% of India's trade and more than 80% of Japan's oil imports transit through the Strait of Malacca. In other words, they go past our waters through the Indian Ocean into the Strait of Malacca, which gives both countries a serious stake in the security of these sea lanes across the Indian Ocean. Recently, in fact, we've been cooperating more and more in defense. There was the famous exercise Malabar, which involves Japan, India and the US, and it reflects a certain wariness about the likely need for understanding amongst all three countries in the event that China's major military expansion begins to acquire unfriendly overtones to either India or Japan. Now, also in East Asia, South Korea has developed an increasingly important relationship with India. Its entrepreneurial multinational corporations having made striking inroads into the Indian market, the South Koreans are way ahead of the Japanese in having captured the consumer space here. So many South Korean brands are now so familiar to us, from Samsung to Hyundai to Daewoo to LG. All of these are South Korean brands, whereas what used to be more famous, the Japanese brands, are decidedly far behind the South Koreans. There's now an active foreign policy and security dialogue between our countries. Even prospects for defense cooperation appear bright. And we've obviously extended our Act East vision to embrace the Republic of Korea as well. There's talk about $10 billion for infrastructure from Korea. And Korea says they'll give that money for things like smart cities. I know Guwahati has been selected as a smart city, unlike Thiruvananthapuram, much to my chagrin. But you've got that potential, powers, railway generation, transmission. And it's interesting because India kept ASEAN at arm's length when ASEAN was first created, seeing the organization as a surrogate for American interests in the Vietnam War. The estrangement ended swiftly when New Delhi wanted it to. That was in 1991. We became a sectoral dialogue partner with ASEAN the very next year, 92, a full dialogue partner in 95, a member of the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific in 96, a summit-level partner, a status accorded previously only to China, Japan, and South Korea in 2002. Then the ASEAN plus 3 meetings became ASEAN plus 6 in order to include India. And Japan made it very clear that they thought that the plus 3 formula gave China too much clout, so they wanted it plus 6 so India would come in and balance China's clout. And India was even made a full member of the East Asian Summit by leaders in Singapore and Indonesia who shared much the same concerns, even though by no stretch of the geopolitical imagination can India be considered an East Asian country. But there we are in the East Asian Summit. Now, India and ASEAN elevated their relationship to the level of a strategic partnership in 2012. There's a counter-terrorism agreement with ASEAN, reflecting the region's increasing worries about Islamist fundamentalism after the Bali bombings. There's a military and security dimension to the policy, and we now have, as you probably do know, an Indian Navy Far Eastern Naval Command established at Port Blair in the Andamans. We organize a gathering of naval fleets, codenamed Milan, every 2 years in Port Blair. We've been doing it now for 20 years. Conducting combined exercises with 11 regional navies, also provide social and professional interactions. So we're creating a tremendous amount of defense cooperation that doesn't make the headlines, but is all part of looking east and acting east. Defense cooperation has also strengthened since 93 with Malaysia. We have the Seychelles, Vietnam, all of which are countries with which we are now developing security relationships. We've also been an active participant in the Regional Cooperation Agreement on combating piracy and armed robbery against ships in Asia. Maritime security has begun to loom much larger in our consciousness since the terrorists of 26/11 hijacked an Indian ship and transported themselves to Mumbai across our waters in an Indian boat. I mean, what kind of security did we have in our waters? We have to fix that, and we are fixing it. Joint naval exercises are being conducted with more and more countries: Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines. And at the same time, this sometimes makes Beijing a bit nervous. And so, for example, one exercise that involved India, Singapore, Japan, and Australia got the plug pulled because it is alleged that Beijing lent rather heavily on Canberra, but subsequently the then Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who's become a friend of mine, denied that hotly and said it was India that pulled the plugs. I don't know what the full story is, but whatever it may be, clearly we are not continuing with that exercise, because while we understand the importance of showing some alternative formulations to China, we don't want to make them too nervous about our intentions either. And that's where things stand at the moment. Now, there's obviously a pressing need today to boost trade, deepen investments, establish a truly ASEAN-India free trade area completely. We need to improve total trade between ASEAN and India, which actually decreased by 5.4% between 2012 and 13, and is far behind from realizing the targets for $100 billion, which was announced by the UPA government and was set at the 2012 ASEAN-India Summit. So I think that the Act East on our part also requires a sort of Act West from them. That we're going to have to make this work together, and it's part of our diplomatic challenge to promote that on their side. We've opened a new diplomatic mission to ASEAN, by the way, this year to push that. Now, trying to wrap up so we can have more of an exchange with each other. In terms of connectivity, economic and infrastructure development in India's northeastern states is obviously crucial to improve connectivity between the northeast and the rest of India, within the northeast itself, and with neighboring countries by establishing new cross-border transportation links. The bigger priority ought to be to connect the rest of India with the northeastern region as a whole, which will require New Delhi to do much more to develop infrastructure in the region than merely announce elaborate infrastructure plans. If New Delhi starts thinking strategically about the northeast, it will have to make actual investments in domestic infrastructure before it thinks of expenditure abroad. Now, as far as the countries abroad are concerned, we also need to invest in developing more multilateral organizations in the region. Do you know, for example, there's a Mekong-Ganga Cooperation Organization. There's the Indian Ocean Rim Association. There's an organization called BIMSTEC, which sounds like beefsteak, but there's not much beef in it. It's not doing as much as it could. Some associations of countries around a common purpose like this. Associations like this can actually have a couple of attractive features because they can permit progress to be made on developmental, environmental, and security issues while benefiting from the exclusion of strategic rivals like Pakistan and China, which don't belong to the Indian Ocean Rim Association or the Ganga-Mekong Cooperation or the BIMSTEC. In fact, I would suggest that we really do take seriously the possibility of developing BIMSTEC. I wrote about this in my 2012 book, Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century. We have a positive trade balance with all the BIMSTEC countries. It's gone up from 7.8 billion in 2007 to 19 billion in 2013. Our imports have also gone up at that time. And I think we should actually conclude long drawn-out negotiations on a BIMSTEC free trade agreement, and that should dramatically increase trade with all the BIMSTEC member countries. I think that it's also important to keep harping on the civilizational connections between the Northeast and Southeast Asia, between India as a whole and our neighbors in Southeast and in East Asia. We really have to stop psychologically confining ourselves to the subcontinent and establishing ourselves as a regional power and take greater advantage of the huge economic advances made by the Southeast Asian nations. It's interesting that 6 of the 20 members of the G20, 6 of the 20, Australia, China, India, Indonesia, Japan and South Korea, all belong to the East Asia Summit. So that's a pretty serious, almost 1/3 of the entire G20 that's managing the macroeconomic conditions of the world. We should do something about that. Now, there are some challenges. If I can remind our friends in the NDA government, our trade, as I said, with ASEAN is not yet at $100 billion. With a few exceptions like Singapore, the visa regime between India and ASEAN countries remains unnecessarily complicated and difficult. Despite the liberalization of air service agreements with ASEAN countries, India's airlines still do not enjoy a comprehensive open skies policy with ASEAN and vice versa. Tourism from ASEAN to India is remarkably lower. The same is true with other East Asian countries like Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan. All of those, there are more Indians going there than those countries' nationals coming to us. It's startling that the land that gave birth to Buddhism has not been able to attract more Buddhists to places like Bodh Gaya, Sarnath and Nalanda, or for that matter to much else that India offers, including the beauties of the state. I would say that visa restrictions are part of the problem and not the whole problem. And then, of course, the terrorist attacks of 26/11 have also played their part, including in promoting a more suspicious attitude on the part of India to some of the travelers from neighboring countries, including China. I would say that we need to shake off this perception that we're much less active in these countries than, say, China or Japan are. There should, of course, to return to the fundamental point, be a clear agenda for linking all the northeastern states together with a network of road, rail, air and river links in order to establish cross-border connectivity. The success of the Act East policy will be contingent on such progress, and the Indian government should earnestly pursue its commitment to the Northeast. I'm calling both for the development of the Northeast as a sincere commitment of the government in New Delhi and the use of that as a springboard to enhance connectivity with South and Southeast Asia. Only then can the government truly claim that it has successfully been able to act east. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.